Chapter 1. The Vanishing from Elder Tree Lane. It began, as so many things in the village of Fernley did, with a tray of scones and a misplaced gardening hat. It was a Wednesday, one of those late spring afternoons when the air smells of hyacinth and grass clippings, and the sound of distant hedge trimmers rises like a hymn from behind every cottage wall. Elder Tree Lane was particularly lively that day, with windows thrown open and neighbours exchanging news across low fences. Miss Lavinia Merridew, who had lived in number 11 since the war, and claimed to know the maiden name of every woman within 3 streets, had just pulled her rhubarb crumble from the oven when she noticed something odd. The house next door, number 13, where young Timothy Alderstone had been staying, had its front door wide open. Now, Fernley was not the sort of place where one locked their doors at noon, but Timothy was a precise young man. Since arriving from London 6 months earlier, he had kept to a schedule that verged on the ceremonial. Morning tea at 8, post collected by 9, bicycle out by 10, and a quiet return just before 6, like clockwork. And yet now, with the hour nearing 2:30, the door stood open, a single walking shoe left haphazardly on the stoop. No bicycle was propped outside. No music drifted from the gramophone in his sitting room. The curtains twitched gently in the breeze. Lavinia narrowed her eyes. She had half a mind to step across and investigate, but she had heard, through Mrs. Merton, who had it from her niece, that Mr. Alderstone was of a literary sort, which, in her view, meant slightly unstable, though undeniably polite. Still, something gnawed at her. She knocked once. Then again. "Timothy?" she called. "Only me, Miss Merridew. You've left your door." No answer. She stepped inside, just enough to call again. The silence met her with eerie finality. By the time she backed out, trembling and flustered, and rang the bell at number 7, where Sergeant Rowe of the local constabulary happened to live with his rather deaf mother, the entire street was rippling with the first whispers of something not being quite right. By 4 o'clock, the constable had thoroughly inspected number 13. The house was tidy, suspiciously so. No sign of struggle, no broken glass. A teacup sat on the kitchen table, its contents half drunk and cold. His bicycle remained in the shed, untouched. His shoes were neatly paired in the hall, save for the bun on the doorstep. His suitcase sat by the wardrobe, half-packed, and of Mr. Timothy Alderstone there was no sign whatsoever. The village, as it tends to do, took little time in forming its own conclusions. "He's run off," declared Mr. Spivey from the butcher shop. "Probably in trouble with the law. Writers always are." "He's been taken," whispered Hetty Dunn, clutching her pearls at the vicarage. "There's a van that parks near the green every Tuesday. Foreign licence plate." "I said from the start," announced Mrs. Emmeline Partridge, "that no man who prefers goat's milk is to be trusted." At the corner of all this was Miss Marple. She had heard the bell tolling unusually in the direction of Elder Tree Lane, and, having finished her pruning of the snapdragons, wandered down just in time to observe the excitement outside number 13. She didn't push forward, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply stood quiet and seemingly peripheral, listening to the flutter of voices and watching the expressions of those gathered. She noted the broken shoelace on the stoop, the faint smudge on the doorframe, finger-length, almost brushed, away, the neatness of the interior, described by Sergeant Rowe in low tones to the vicar, and most importantly, she noted the absence of anything remotely emotional. No note, no sign of distress, no belongings taken. Disappearance without drama, she thought, was always more dramatic in the end. That evening, she returned to her cottage with a great deal more on her mind than pruning. By the next morning, word of the vanishing had reached every soul in Fernley, and several in the neighbouring villages. Scotland Yard was not yet called. Sergeant Rowe still held out hope it would all prove to be a misunderstanding, or at worst, a private matter resolved quietly by letter. But Miss Marple was not so sure. She sat at her breakfast table, knitting. Gently, when the doorbell rang, it was Rev Hartley. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," he said nervously. "But you've heard about young Mr. Alderston, haven't you?" "I have. Well, the thing is, I fear something may be quite wrong." "Oh?" Reverend Hartley lowered his voice. "Last week he came to me, Timothy. He asked if I could keep something safe for him. A small parcel. He said it wasn't dangerous, only delicate, confidential. And did you?" "I did. It's in the church vestry." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And you haven't opened it?" He looked horrified. "Certainly not." "Then perhaps we ought to open it together." Inside the vestry, beneath the narrow arch of the stained-glass window, the parcel waited, no larger than a tea-tin, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. Miss Marple examined it carefully before breaking the seal. Inside was a single glove, not new, men's, soft leather with faint writing in blue ink, scrawled along the inside lining. 3 words. It was her. Miss Marple turned to the Reverend, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said softly, "I think we've just been invited into a rather private story. One with a missing gentleman, a mysterious accusation, and likely more than one very flustered woman." She stood, tucking the glove into her handbag. "Come, Reverend, I believe it's time we take a stroll down Elder Tree Lane." Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By midday, Elder Tree Lane had transformed from a quiet cul-de-sac into a veritable corridor of concern. Curtains were pulled back so often they barely had time to rest in place, and neighbours who hadn't spoken in weeks were suddenly recalling the smallest details about Mr. Timothy Alderston's routines: what time he fetched the paper, how frequently he trimmed his hedges, and whether he took sugar in his tea. Word had spread quickly that Miss Marple had been seen entering the church vestry with Reverend Hartley and had emerged carrying a parcel. By the time she returned to her cottage, several theories were already swirling like leaves in the wind. "She's found a clue," said Mrs. Ethel Cranston to her neighbour across the fence. "Probably something dreadful. Poison or a letter." "I'll bet it was a suicide note," whispered Mr. Appleby the grocer. "But coded, like those spy films." "Rubbish," declared Miss Lavinia Merridew. "He was pushed into the canal, or blackmailed by a lady poet. He did wear those shoes with the funny buckles." By 4 o'clock, a quiet nervousness settled over the village. Timothy's disappearance no longer seemed like a temporary misadventure or an impromptu retreat to London. Something was very wrong. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken the leather glove from her handbag and set it neatly beside her cup of tea. She was seated by the window in her drawing-room, the morning sun catching the glint of the ink that still stained the glove's inner lining. It was her, not "it was me," which would suggest a confession. Not "it was him," a deflection. "It was her" was something altogether different. An accusation. And what made it more curious was its deliberate secrecy. Had Timothy anticipated his own disappearance? Or was this a piece of a puzzle yet to reveal itself? Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment and retraced the faces of the lane in her mind. Timothy Alderston, 33, bachelor, author of modest success, new to the village but charming when engaged, kept a regular schedule, wrote most mornings, cycled to the post, attended church twice a month, had a penchant for elderflower wine and solitary evening walks. And he had, by all accounts, no enemies. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust such statements. A village was a living organism of small tensions and large egos, where one could develop enemies simply by winning the vegetable competition 3 years in a row. And so she began with what she did best, listening. Her first stop was the garden, gate of Mrs. Emmeline Partridge, who, under the guise of weeding her marigolds, was doing her best to keep an eye on Elder Tree Lane. "Oh, Jane," she said, feigning surprise, "I didn't see you there." Miss Marple smiled. "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your flowers." Mrs. Partridge waved a hand. "They've been looking dreadful since the frost. But tell me, what's to become of it all? Has there been any word? I was rather hoping you might tell me." Mrs. Partridge leaned in, eager. "Well, it's no surprise if you ask me. These London men, they come here for peace and end up finding all sorts of trouble. I dare say he was mixed up with someone." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Mixed up how?" "Oh, I wouldn't like to say." She paused. "But he was seen more than once in conversation with Mrs. Delphine Ridley." Now that was a name worth. Hearing Delphine Ridley had been the talk of Fernley ever since she returned from Spain last spring, following the death of her husband. She'd taken up residence in a quaint overgrown cottage at the far end of the lane, wore flowing scarves, and was given to painting abstract landscapes that she claimed were inspired by emotional resonance. Most villagers didn't quite know what to make of her. "Do you suppose," Miss Marple asked gently, "that Mrs. Ridley and Mr. Alderston were close?" Mrs. Partridge pursed her lips. "They weren't not close." Miss Marple nodded politely and moved on. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the vicarage, where Rev Hartley greeted her with a warm smile and a furrowed brow. "I've just returned from speaking with Sergeant Rowe," he said. "He's requested official support from the county constabulary. They're treating it as a missing person case, for now." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. "Have you told anyone about the glove?" "No, as you advised." "Then might I ask one more favour?" "Anything. I'd like to attend Mrs. Ridley's next gathering." The vicar blinked. "She's holding one?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "She's invited half the village to an impromptu reading of her poetry tomorrow evening. Her way of easing tension, apparently." "Poetry," the vicar said, sighing. "And red wine," Miss Marple added. "She keeps it imported from Portugal." The next evening, Miss Marple walked the gravel path toward Mrs. Ridley's ivy-laced cottage. Inside, candlelight flickered in shallow glass jars, and a heady scent of rosemary and paint turpentine filled the air. Mrs. Ridley herself stood at the centre of the parlour, draped in violet silk, her hair piled atop her head in artful disorder. "Miss Marple," she said with affected warmth, "I hadn't expected such grace." "I never pass up a well-constructed stanza," Miss Marple replied. They smiled at one another, two women from entirely different worlds, yet both acutely aware of the masks people wore. The guests settled. Mrs. Ridley read 3 poems, one about the sea, one about a door that never closed, and one about a man who vanished in the rain. Miss Marple watched her closely, watched, too, how her hands trembled ever so slightly as she held the pages, and how her voice cracked when she said, "Some people leave footprints behind, not to be followed, but to remind you they walked away." After the reading, Miss Marple approached, her by the sideboard where glasses of port were being poured. "Touching verses," she said. "They came quickly after the events. You were close to Mr. Alderston." Delphine hesitated. "He was a thoughtful man, observant. Did he ever confide in you?" A longer pause. "He said once that he was writing something too dangerous to finish. I thought it was a metaphor." Miss Marple set down her glass. "Sometimes it's not." Then, almost casually, she withdrew the glove from her bag and laid it on the table between them. Delphine's expression shifted, just a flicker. Miss Marple smiled softly. "You see," she said, "even gloves can point fingers." Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The morning after Mrs. Delphine Ridley's poetry reading dawned crisp and silver, the kind of morning that encouraged the villagers of Fernley to leave their laundry hanging an extra hour in the sun. Yet despite the pleasant weather and the murmurs of spring, there remained an unease running beneath the village's usual rhythm, an invisible thread that tugged at conversations and lingered in pauses. Mr. Timothy Alderston was still missing. And Miss Marple, having spent the better part of the early hours knitting and reflecting beside her parlour window, had come to a quiet decision. It was time to begin asking questions in earnest. She did not carry a notebook nor a handbag this time, just her walking stick and a small tin of lozenges. She preferred to seem as though she were out for nothing more than a constitutional, which made it all the more surprising when people found themselves revealing things they hadn't meant to say at all. Her first stop was the baker's, a warm, yeasty place where gossip often rose as fast as the dough. "Ah, Miss Marple," chirped Daisy Lennox, wiping flour from her hands. "Out for your morning stroll?" "I thought I'd fetch a currant bun," said Miss Marple, "and perhaps hear the latest theory." Daisy grinned. "Well, you won't believe it, but Mr. Appleby swears he saw Timothy Alderston arguing with Hume. Someone outside the post office last Tuesday. Quite heated, he said. A woman, tall, with a red scarf." "Mrs. Ridley owns a red scarf," Miss Marple said mildly. "Oh, yes," Daisy whispered, "and Mrs. Merridew says she was seen crying in her garden the next morning." "Was she?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Well, sometimes a rose thorn can make one cry, even if it's not the thorn's fault." The next stop was the home of Colonel Geoffrey Dalrymple, retired, formerly of the King's Own Rifles, now commander of nothing more than his overgrown rosebeds and a pair of suspicious spaniels. He had lived in Fernley longer than any of the newer residents and, fancied himself an observer of people as well as birds. Timothy Alderston? He snorted. Odd fellow, always sketching in that little black book of his. Wouldn't be surprised if he ran afoul of one of those pieces of research he was working on. Research? Miss Marple asked, settling into a creaky deck chair on his patio. Oh, yes, said he was writing something to do with inheritance disputes. Asked me about the Jessup family, can you believe it? Said he'd heard they had a claim on the land where the Ridleys now live. Miss Marple's knitting paused ever so slightly. The Ridleys? Well, technically it was her husband's estate. Delphine came after. But yes, she got everything when Edmund died in Spain. Nasty fall, they say. And the Jessops? Miss Marple asked. What became of them? Fell on hard times. Moved up north, I think. But they always claimed the will had been changed. Never found the new one, though. Curious, murmured Miss Marple. Colonel Dalrymple gave a short bark of laughter. Timothy probably fancied himself an amateur detective. Likely tripped over something bigger than he could handle. Or someone, Miss Marple added. By midday, she stopped at the church, not to pray, though she offered a brief nod to St. Luke, but to speak to Rev Hartley, who was in his study cataloguing hymnals. There's something I've been wondering, she said after exchanging pleasantries and accepting a cup of overly sweet tea. You said Timothy Alderston left you that parcel, but had he ever left anything else in your care? Rev Hartley frowned. Not directly, though, now that you mention it, he did leave a stack of papers in the choir loft about a week ago. Scribbled notes. When I asked, he said he was revising something. Did you happen to keep them? The Reverend rose, rummaged in a drawer, and produced a manila folder. Inside were 5 or 6 pages of untidy handwriting and crossed-out lines. Miss Marple read in silence. Lineage claims disputed. 1957 deed retracted. Mention of altered witness signatures. Correspondence. With Ridley family, Geraldine Jessup denies validity. Her eyes narrowed. It appears, she said softly, that Mr. Alderstone was researching more than fiction. That afternoon, as the clouds thickened and the scent of impending rain crept in with the breeze, Miss Marple made her final stop. Mrs. Ridley's cottage looked as composed as ever. The blinds were drawn, the gate latch freshly oiled. She answered the door herself, in another silk robe and bare feet that seemed entirely too theatrical for the day's chill. Miss Marple, she said coolly, come to interrogate me again? Do hope not, Miss Marple said, stepping inside with quiet confidence. I find it better to listen than accuse. She settled into an armchair uninvited, her eyes taking in the room's details. A framed photograph of Delphine and her late husband on a boat, a fire flickering in the hearth, though the day was warm, and on the writing desk a sheaf of paper with a pen still uncapped beside it. Are you writing something new? Miss Marple asked, gesturing. Mrs. Ridley's lips tightened. Poetry, catharsis. Ah, said Miss Marple, catharsis can be rather dangerous, depending on who it's aimed at. Delphine said nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands. You knew Timothy was writing about the Jessup land claim, didn't you? Delphine's expression did not shift. Knew, Miss Marple continued gently, that if he found any legal irregularities about the Ridley estate, it could mean trouble, especially if your late husband's will was not as secure as everyone believed. Still, Mrs. Ridley said nothing. Miss Marple tilted her head. "He trusted you, you know. Spoke of you warmly. Left a clue. A glove with a message." Delphine looked away. "He was careless," she said at last. "No," said Miss Marple, standing. "He was careful. That glove wasn't carelessness. It was insurance." She walked to the door. "I do hope you'll be honest with the constable when he calls, because I expect the next thing they'll find is the rest of his manuscript. Hidden, perhaps, but not well enough." She gave Delphine one last gentle smile. After all, some truths write themselves, don't they? Chapter 4. First Suspects. The storm finally broke the next morning, not in thunder or lightning, but in the kind of persistent whispering rain that soaked through hedges and thoughts alike. Elder Tree Lane glistened with puddles, the tulips drooped, and the village's usual foot traffic dwindled to glances through wet panes and murmured speculations over teapots. Timothy Alderston remained missing, and the whispers had begun to turn into finger-pointing. Sergeant Rowe, usually a man of cautious steps and broader sympathies, had finally accepted that this was no mere case of a literary recluse vanishing into thin air. He had paid visits, asked questions, and by noon arrived at Miss Marple's front door, not officially, of course, but with his hat damp and eyes troubled. "I don't know what to think any more, Miss Marple," he admitted over tea. "The lad left no note. His papers are all over the place, some here, some tucked in the vicarage, and others, well, nowhere. No sign of a struggle, and no real evidence of harm. But no one just walks away without a reason." Miss Marple, who was spooning lemon curd onto a bit of toast, looked thoughtful. "No one," she said gently, "who isn't being pursued or frightened into silence." "Do you think it was the woman?" he asked, then caught himself. "I mean Mrs. Ridley." "I think Mrs. Ridley is a clever woman, possibly too clever for her own safety," Miss Marple replied. "But cleverness doesn't necessarily mean guilt. It simply makes one harder to read." Sergeant Rowe sighed. "What about the papers? The inheritance dispute, that land business?" "Ah," Miss Marple said, "there you may be closer than you realize. There's a history there, old families, bitter resentments, and money always muddles the waters. But that Jessup girl, Geraldine, she's long gone, isn't she?" "Gone from Fernley," Miss Marple said. "But people who feel cheated rarely disappear completely, and those who feel they've been robbed often return with intentions, more dangerous than legal petitions." The sergeant leaned forward. "You're saying there could be another party involved?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple said, "that someone else had something to lose besides Mrs. Ridley." By the afternoon, the sergeant had begun quietly questioning those who had once known the Jessops. Few remembered much. Most waved their hands vaguely and said something about that dreadful business, and how Geraldine had always been "it is strange little thing." But one name came up more than once: Mrs. Cora Feltham. Cora had once been a companion to the late Mrs. Jessup, a woman known for her stern brows and unforgiving nature. After the Jessops left Fernley, Cora remained in a modest cottage near the edge of the woods, rarely seen and even more rarely heard from. Some said she spent her days sewing. Others swore she wrote long, embittered letters to the editor of the Fernley Gazette under a false name. Miss Marple, of course, remembered her well. It was late in the day when she ventured out, umbrella in hand, to pay a call. The cottage was small but neat. A row of violets lined the window boxes, and smoke curled from the chimney. When Miss Marple knocked, it took a full minute before the door creaked open. "Miss Marple," said Cora, her eyes sharp behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. "Haven't seen you in a decade." "You've aged beautifully, Cora." "I've aged truthfully," Cora replied, and stepped aside. They sat in the narrow parlour. The ticking of a clock and the faint hiss of a kettle filled the silence. "I hear the Jessops are in the wind again," Cora said, pouring tea. "Of a sort," Miss Marple replied, "though I imagine you know more than most about their affairs." Cora shrugged. Geraldine was cheated, plain and simple. Her uncle rewrote the will just days before his death. No one saw it coming. Left everything to that woman, Delphine. Do you believe she manipulated him? "I don't believe she had to," said Cora. "Men like Edmund Ridley fall for glamour like ducks to breadcrumbs." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And Timothy Alderston?" she asked quietly. "Did you ever speak to him?" "Only once. He came here poking around. Wanted to know about the old Ridley estate, land deeds, boundary lines, nonsense like that. I told him to leave. It alone said he'd stir ghosts." "Did he mention a manuscript?" Cora's gaze flickered. "No, but he was writing something that I could tell." "And did he seem frightened?" "He didn't know enough to be frightened, but someone made him afraid, I'd wager." Miss Marple left the cottage with a mind full of threads beginning to pull tight. Back in the village, the tide of suspicion had shifted. The younger women in the shop were now whispering about Cora Feltham herself, her long-standing grudge, her seclusion, the bitterness she carried like perfume. Some claimed she'd been in love with the elder Ridley. Others swore she had once been engaged to a Jessop cousin. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. As always, truth was far less elaborate and far more human. That evening, as the storm receded and the wind grew softer, a curious development arrived. Sergeant Rowe, winded from the walk, appeared at Miss Marple's door with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "They found it," he said. "A young lad kicking his football near the river. This was buried under a patch of reeds. Inside the cloth was a book, black leather, water-stained, but intact. Timothy Alderston's manuscript." Miss Marple opened it slowly. It was not a novel. It was a collection of notes, interviews, land maps, witness statements, and letters. At the back, carefully sealed in a plastic pouch, was a copy of the missing will. The real will, signed by Edmund Ridley and 2 witnesses, one of whom was Cora Feltham. And the final line, handwritten by Timothy, read, "One woman forged the signature, but another woman knew and kept quiet. Until now." Miss Marple closed the book. "Now," she said softly, "we shall see what silence is worth." Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The manuscript, though water-stained and bearing the scent of river reed and mildew, had clearly been prepared with methodical care. Miss Marple spent the better part of the following morning poring over its pages with the diligence of someone untangling embroidery thread, careful not to miss a knot, a twist, or a break. She read the statements Alderston had gathered from various villagers, many of them likely unaware that they had been speaking on record. observations about the Ridley estate, remarks about missing documents, details from old boundary disputes. But what struck her most was not what was in the manuscript. It was what was missing. There was a note at the top of one page that read, "Interview with E.F. Significant hesitation. Check signature against records at parish archives. Last seen with Delphine, morning of 12th Joe E.F. Cora Feltham." Miss Marple tapped the page with one finger. The timeline was tightening. Timothy had known there was a forgery involved in the will that awarded Delphine Ridley her late husband's estate. He suspected it had been orchestrated, or at least shielded, by someone in the village. Cora had every reason to keep quiet. Loyalty to the Jessops, perhaps, or resentment of how she had been excluded from the estate. But the mention of Cora being last seen with Delphine was something new. Delphine had not mentioned it. Cora certainly hadn't, and yet Timothy had marked it and intended to cross-reference a signature. That meant he had found something concrete. Something too dangerous to publish, and perhaps just dangerous enough to disappear over. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple was already halfway up the steps to the small annex beside St. Swithin's Church, where the village kept its modest archive. Mrs. Withers, the parish secretary, was more than happy to allow her access. "Oh, yes, dear," she said. "Do poke about. No one's opened those old will records in years. There's dust enough to knit a sweater." Miss Marple smiled and went straight to the filing drawer marked Ridley, Edmund, 1957. Inside were 3 documents: the official will, the earlier draft from 1953, and a handwritten note in a fine copperplate hand that stated the terms of transfer to Delphine Ridley, witnessed and signed. She examined the signature of the second witness, C. Feltham. And then she noticed something else, something most would overlook. The ink on the rest of the page had gently faded, as ink naturally does over time. But the ink used to write C. Feltham was darker, slightly shinier in texture, less aged, more recent. She retrieved a magnifying glass from her handbag and leaned closer. The ink was different, and the pressure heavier, less fluent. Someone had altered the page, or perhaps someone had signed it well after the original document had been created. As Miss Marple emerged from the archive, she saw Sergeant Rowe crossing the churchyard. "Ah, Miss Marple," he called. "I was just heading to your cottage. We've received something odd at the station." She raised a brow. "Do tell." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat. Anonymous envelope, no return address, just this inside. Miss Marple took it and unfolded the sheet. It was a torn page from a diary, slightly scorched at the edges, as though it had been partially burned and salvaged at the last moment. The entry read, "I didn't want to be part of it. She said it would all be over soon, that no one would ask questions, but I knew she had the glove, and now she's afraid someone saw." Miss Marple folded the paper and handed it back. "Someone's conscience is growing teeth." Rowe frowned. "You think it was Cora?" "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that Cora knows much more than she wants anyone to believe. But I no longer believe she's the one who signed that will." Rowe blinked. "You think Delphine forged it?" "I think she may have forged the signature using Cora's name." and I think Cora has been shielding her, out of guilt or fear, or both. Then we need to speak to her again." "Not yet," Miss Marple said. "We need her to come to us." That afternoon, the wind picked up and blew rain against the windows of Fernley's tea shop, where Miss Marple sat with a pot of Earl Grey and a quiet expression. Across the room, a few local ladies murmured about missing persons and ruined wills, but she paid them no mind. She was watching the door, and just before 3 o'clock, Cora Feltham entered. She looked older than she had the day before. Her scarf was askew. Her eyes darted once before settling on Miss Marple. "Do you mind?" she asked. "Not at all." Cora sat heavily. "You found it, didn't you?" "The page. I found more than that," Miss Marple said kindly. "I found that you didn't sign the will, that someone else did, likely using a sample of your writing. Perhaps something from a letter." Cora's lips trembled. "I told her not to." "But you didn't stop her." Cora looked down. She said she loved him, that he promised her everything, that it was only a matter of correcting the paperwork to reflect what he'd have done. Anyway, she cried, Jane. I'd never seen her cry, not Delphine. "So you let her alter the page. I didn't know she was going to bury the original. I thought she just wanted to tidy things." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And Timothy?" Cora's face broke. "He came to me the day before he disappeared. He told me he'd found the inconsistency, that he had the manuscript ready. He said he'd give Delphine one last chance to come clean. But she didn't take it." Cora shook her head. She said no one would believe him. She said she'd burn it all if she had to. And then he vanished. Miss Marple reached out and gently placed her hand on Cora's. "You've held this too long, my dear." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "I didn't know how to fix it." "You just have," Miss Marple said. By evening, Sergeant Rowe had taken a full statement from Cora Feltham, and a quiet search warrant was prepared for the Ridley cottage. Miss Marple remained at home, knitting by the fire. She had seen the signs from the start. The too-clean room, the glove with a message, the woman who played the poet and the widow too well. But the most telling clue, she reflected, was the ink that hadn't aged. Time, after all, leaves its mark. And when something doesn't fade, someone has something to hide. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Rain clung stubbornly to the eaves of Fernley's rooftops that night, and the village seemed to exhale in hushed anticipation. Windows glowed dimly behind net curtains. Doors were bolted earlier than usual. Something had shifted, not yet named, but palpably known. At precisely 7 o'clock, Sergeant Rowe and 2 constables arrived at Delphine Ridley's ivy-smothered cottage. Their knock was not impolite, but firm enough to declare intention. Miss Marple, invited not as a participant, but as a silent observer, stood a little way behind under the brim of her waxed hat, hands clasped neatly around the crook of her walking stick. Delphine opened the door herself. She was dressed in grey silk, not flamboyant this time, but austere. Her eyes flicked from the officers to Miss Marple and back again. For one long second she didn't speak. "Mrs. Ridley," said Sergeant Rowe with practised civility, "we'd like a word, and we'll be conducting a brief search of the premises." "You've no warrant," she said coldly. Roe produced the folded parchment. "Signed this afternoon." She did not reach for it, only stepped aside, spine straight, lips tight. "Very well. Come in." The search began in silence. One constable moved toward the back of the house. Another began opening drawers in the writing desk. Delphine watched, unmoving. From the centre of the room, Miss Marple wandered to the sideboard and lifted a small brass frame. "You keep his photograph near the wine cabinet," she remarked quietly. Delphine did not reply. "It's always telling where we place the dead," Miss Marple went on. "Some people choose the mantelpiece, or beside the bed. But here, next to your Portuguese port and your half-used candle stubs, I wonder, was he a drinker?" "My husband drank when he was alive," Delphine said, her voice brittle. "And, after his death, I kept some of his habits out of loyalty." "How touching!" Delphine's gaze narrowed. "You're not here as a friend?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but I am here as someone who recognizes the difference between grief and performance." A tense silence followed. "Mrs. Ridley," said Sergeant Roe, now returning from the study, "we've recovered the original will, and we have a signed statement from Miss Feltham regarding its forgery. There will be formal proceedings, but, more urgently, the boy," Delphine cut in. "You want to know where he is?" The room fell still. Miss Marple watched her closely. Delphine's hands were tight at her sides. Her face was expressionless. But there was something in the eyes, something fighting not to surface. "He came to me," she said at last, "that night. He said he knew about the forgery, said he had proof, told me I had 48 hours to confess, or he'd go to the papers." Sergeant Roe leaned forward. "And then I asked him to stay. He refused. I asked if he would destroy what he found. He laughed. 'Did you threaten him?' I told him he was arrogant. That's not an answer." Delphine turned to the fire. "He left, walked out into the rain. That's the last I saw of him." "You didn't stop him?" "No, you didn't follow him." Delphine said nothing. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "someone else did." Delphine turned sharply. "What?" Miss Marple moved closer. "You see," she continued, "I wondered for a while if you were protecting someone. But you weren't. You were protecting yourself. You buried the will, and when Timothy uncovered it, you tried to intimidate him into silence. But intimidation isn't control. So someone else stepped in. Someone who felt you were losing your grip." Delphine's eyes darted toward the hallway, toward the rear of the house. Miss Marple followed the glance. A moment later, a soft footstep echoed on the floorboards. It was Clara, Delphine's housemaid, barely more than 19, pale as linen, with a mess of dark curls and hands that trembled as she clutched a drying cloth. I only meant to scare him," Frippy whispered. "Clara," Delphine hissed, "go upstairs." But the girl stood her ground. "He said he'd ruin her," she said. "Said she'd be arrested, that she'd lose everything. He was shouting in the garden. I heard him through the window, and she was crying." "No one cries for me," Delphine snapped. "He made you afraid," Clara said, eyes welling, "and I couldn't bear it. So I went after him, just to stop him, just to make him drop the pages." "And what did you do?" asked Sergeant Roe. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "I pushed him. down by the path near the old gate." Silence. Miss Marple's heart sank, though her expression did not change. "He fell," Clara continued. "Not far, but he hit his head on the stones. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't. He wasn't breathing." Delphine's face had gone ashen. "I panicked," the girl said. "I didn't mean to. I buried him in the ravine." Sergeant Rowe stepped forward. "You'll have to come with us." "No," Delphine said sharply. "She did it for me. I take responsibility. She was only protecting." "What you built on lies," Miss Marple said. She turned to Clara. "You mustn't speak another word without proper counsel, my dear." Clara, silent now, nodded slowly. By the time the officers left, rain had started again. Not sharp and driving, but slow, soft, cleansing. Miss Marple remained a moment longer in the doorway. Delphine was seated by the hearth, face turned to the window. The flames flickered against the glass. "You could have stopped her," Miss Marple said gently. "But you let the storm come to your door. You only tried to shut it out once it had crossed your threshold." Delphine didn't look up. Miss Marple turned and stepped into the rain, her shawl pulled close. Some truths, she knew, needed to be carried through silence. Others, like Timothy's manuscript, had their own voice, etched in ink and consequence. Chapter 7. Another twist. The events at the Ridley cottage sent a fresh tremor through Fernley. By the following morning, everyone in the village, whether from whispered conversation, intercepted phone calls, or second-hand recollection of third-hand tales, knew that Clara Simmons, the maid, had confessed to the disappearance of Timothy Alderston. But Fernley was a village accustomed to tidy explanations, and something about this one did not sit comfortably. "She's a slip of a girl," muttered Mrs. Merridew over a pot of tea. "Barely 5 stone. You'd need more than nerves to move a grown man's body through the ravine." "She said she buried him with a spade from the gardener's shed," said Mr. Appleby helpfully. "But have you seen that path? Even in dry weather it's a bog." "Too convenient," said Colonel Dalrymple, with his usual military certainty. "Too neat by half." And for once Miss Marple found herself agreeing with all of them. Sergeant Rowe, though a decent man, had his limits. He had taken Clara into custody with quiet efficiency and had questioned her under proper supervision. The girl remained firm in her story. She had followed Timothy down the garden path after overhearing the argument. She had only wanted to frighten him, grab the manuscript, destroy it, somehow delay the truth he was ready to unleash. But then came the stumble, the fall, the stone. It was an unfortunate accident, she insisted, a tragic one. And yet there were cracks, hairline fractures. In her narrative, "I didn't move him far," she had said, "just near the ravine edge." "But how did you carry him?" Rowe asked. "I don't remember. I was in shock. And then the details about the grave were vague. No real sense of where, how deep, what she used, whether he had bled, whether his bicycle had been taken. And there Miss Marple paused. The bicycle. It had not been in the shed. That fact, unimportant to many, stood out to Miss Marple like an unfinished stitch in an otherwise tidy pattern. She called on Rowe that afternoon, arriving with her shawl damp from the drizzle and a question already on her lips. "Has the bicycle been found?" Rowe blinked. "No, actually. We've searched the property and surrounding woods. Nothing. That's odd, don't you think?" He frowned. "Could have been tossed in the stream." "Possible, but unlikely. A frightened girl, panicked, burying a body in haste. Why would she think to hide the bicycle too?" Rose sat back. "You're suggesting she had help?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that she's covering for someone. Someone stronger. Someone who knew exactly what was at stake if Timothy's manuscript ever saw the light of day." "Delphine?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, she may be a forger and a manipulator, but she isn't violent, and certainly not reckless." "Well, that narrows it." "Not entirely," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, who else had something to lose? Who else knew about Timothy's investigation into the Jessup Ridley inheritance?" Roe rubbed his chin. "Cora Feltham. She knew," Miss Marple allowed. "But she feared exposure, not consequence. No, there's one person we've overlooked." "Who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The man who delivered the anonymous note to the station." Roe blinked. "The burned diary page." "Precisely." Roe leaned forward. "You think that was a decoy?" "I think it was an attempt to end the inquiry, by leading it neatly to Clara and letting her confession seal the story." "But the handwriting was feminine," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Feminine, yes. But if forged once, why not forged again? And who in this village knows enough about Cora Feltham's handwriting to imitate it convincingly?" The answer dawned slowly. "Reverend Hartley," Roe murmured. Miss Marple's smile deepened. "He was Cora's confidant," she said. "Before she retreated into solitude, she volunteered at the parish. She wrote all the vestry minutes for 3 years. He'd seen her hand more often than anyone. But why would he?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "he was the second witness on the forged will." Roe paled. "His signature appears alongside Cora's on the false document," she continued. "And if Timothy had discovered both signatures were forged, if the vicar himself were implicated, his position, his reputation, his entire standing would be ruined." Rose stood. "If you're right, then Clara was protecting the wrong person." That evening, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage under a sky bruised with rain clouds. The bell at St. Swithin's struck 7 as she arrived. Reverend Hartley answered her knock with his usual gentle smile, but there was tension around the edges of his mouth. "Miss Marple," he said, "what brings you by?" "An old question," she replied. "One I've carried with me since the day I read that forged will." He stepped aside. "You'd better come in." She did. Inside, the sitting room was warm, the fire low, and a teacup sat abandoned on the side table. She glanced once toward the bureau where he kept the parish ledgers. One drawer was slightly ajar. "Timothy came to you before he disappeared," she said. "Didn't he?" Hartley exhaled slowly, sat down. "Yes," he said. "He said he knew. About the signatures, about the land, about the trust I'd betrayed." "Did he threaten to expose you?" "He didn't need to. I knew what came next." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So you followed him?" Hartley's eyes glistened. He was so sure of himself, so confident. He had no idea what that truth would do to this village, to the parish, to everything we built here. "So you pushed him?" "No, not at first." He looked up. "I confronted him by the ravine. We argued. I asked for the manuscript. He refused. And then Then I saw Clara. She had followed us. I think she wanted to intervene, to calm things. But in the moment, he lunged past me, and I pushed back. Miss Marple didn't speak. He fell, Hartley whispered. It wasn't deep, but his head struck the stones. Clara screamed. And you buried him, Miss Marple said. You had Clara keep silent, and you crafted a story she could live with. I told her to protect Delphine, he murmured. She believed that meant loyalty, but really, it was me I was protecting. Miss Marple stood slowly. You must turn yourself in. Hartley looked up, face hollow. And what of the parish? Truth, she said, is what the parish needs most of all. As she left the vicarage, the rain began again. Quiet, steady, relentless. Miss Marple paused to glance back at the church tower, its cross barely visible through the mist. Even stone, she thought, can crumble beneath the weight of a lie. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning following Reverend Hartley's quiet confession broke cold and clear, as though Fernley itself had held its breath through the storm and was now bracing for what must come next. The air smelt of soaked earth and old stone. The crows on the chapel roof were silent, and the town square, usually alive with greetings and clatter by 8, seemed stunned into pause. Miss Marple, however, was not paused. She was knitting, calmly, precisely, while Sergeant Rowe paced her parlour like a man both relieved and unnerved by the truth he'd been given. "You're certain?" he asked, pausing mid-turn by the fireplace. "The vicar, of all people?" Miss Marple did not look up from her yarn. "Only the truly desperate wrap their sins in sanctity. And desperation, Sergeant, is an excellent motivator for moral contortions." He said Clara was present. That she saw the fall. She saw the aftermath. Miss Marple corrected gently. But she didn't understand what she saw. Not fully. Hartley shaped the story to absolve himself. He let her believe she'd done something terrible. Rowe exhaled and dropped into the armchair opposite her. "It's not right. That poor girl—" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But now that we know the truth, we must give her the chance to see it too." By mid-morning, Clara Simmons sat nervously on the church bench, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve as Miss Marple arrived with the poise of someone visiting an old friend. "I'm not supposed to be out long," Clara whispered. "The sergeant said—" "He knows I asked you here," Miss Marple said kindly. "You won't be in trouble, not for telling the truth." Clara's eyes brimmed. "But I already did. I told everything." "You told what you believed," Miss Marple said, lowering herself gently beside her. "That's not quite the same." Clara looked at her, unsure. "You were told Timothy fell." "That you were the reason," Miss Marple continued softly. "But what if he had already fallen before you arrived? What if in your panic you trusted the wrong version of events?" Clara paled. He was lying there, still. The vicar said, "The vicar told you to protect Mrs. Ridley, because you admired her, but really he asked you to protect him." Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew the scorched diary page, the one anonymously sent to the police. She handed it to Clara. "I believe you wrote this." Clara looked down at the page and blinked rapidly. "How did you— You wanted someone to know," Miss Marple said gently. Even if you couldn't say it aloud, Clara's lower lip trembled. He made it sound like it was better for everyone, that the truth would only make things worse. Miss Marple placed a hand over hers. The truth always makes things worse, before it makes them better. Clara nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Miss Marple gave her hand a final pat. "You've done the hardest part already. Now, all that's left is the telling." That afternoon, the town gathered under the long nave of St. Swithin's for a hastily arranged service. Not quite a funeral, not quite a vigil. The church pews were full, and the air hummed with murmured speculations. Word had spread, as it always did in Fernley, that Timothy Alderston's manuscript had been recovered, and that the truth of his disappearance was no longer whispered, but named. Rev Hartley, to no one's surprise, did not lead the service. It was instead conducted by Reverend Elliot, from the neighbouring parish in Little Wetherby, a gentle, bookish man who knew none of the players well and preferred not to know too much. His sermon was vague, his tone kindly abstract. But when the service ended and the villagers filtered into the grey afternoon, it was Miss Marple who remained seated. She did not rise when Delphine Ridley approached her, nor when the woman sat beside her, chin lifted as if daring Miss Marple to scold. "You win," Delphine said quietly. "This isn't a game." "No," Delphine said, "but you've taken everything I had left. My name, my home, my reputation." "I didn't take them," Miss Marple said gently. "You lost them, one deceit at a time." Delphine looked straight ahead at the altar. "And the girl? She'll testify? She'll tell the truth, and so will you." Delphine was silent. After a long moment she said, "He was kind to me, in his own way. Timothy. But kindness doesn't undo what's already been done." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but it's often where justice begins." Later that evening, as dusk settled into the bones of the village and the street lamps blinked to life one by one, Miss Marple sat by her garden window, a cup of tea warming her hands. The manuscript lay open beside her. It would be given to the authorities, of course, but tonight she let herself reread a single passage. "People believe truth arrives like thunder, but more often it is the sound of a single step on a quiet path. It waits until you are still, then it finds you." She closed the book and smiled. For all his cleverness, Timothy Alderston had not anticipated how deeply buried secrets could be, or how far people would go to keep them that way. But he had known enough to leave behind his voice, his glove, his clues, and that, in the end, had been just enough. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The village of Fernley had endured its share of whispered scandals, an elopement or two, an unfortunate kitchen fire involving brandy and Christmas pudding, and the time the choir mistress had gone to Brighton and returned with a different surname. But nothing had ever shaken its core like the disappearance of Timothy Alderston. Now, with the fog of confusion lifting and the truth glinting beneath the surface, it was time for the whole story to be laid bare. And as always, it fell to Miss Marple to do it. The location, fittingly, was the drawing-room of the Ridley cottage, soon to be reclaimed by the Jessup family, barring legal objections. A modest circle had been invited by Sergeant Rowe. Delphine Ridley, as a matter of obligation. Cora Feltham, as a reluctant witness. Clara Simmons, as a shaken but now cleared party, and Rev Hartley, brought in under quiet escort from the editor, holding room at the station. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her hands folded over her handbag, her shawl drawn close. There was no drama in her presence, no severity, only that gently terrifying composure which made one long to confess, even if one were innocent. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice low but clear. "It's important, I think, that we understand what truly happened, not just to Mr. Alderston, but to the lives entwined around his disappearance." No one spoke. Even the fire in the grate crackled softly, as if listening. Miss Marple continued. "Timothy arrived in Fernley under the pretext of writing a novel, but in truth he was investigating a long-standing legal dispute, the Ridley estate and the Jessup claim. He discovered what no one had the courage to say aloud, that Edmund Ridley's final will had been forged." Delphine stiffened but said nothing. The forgery involved two names, Cora Feltham and Rev Hartley. Cora's was used without her knowledge. The Reverend's, well, he has admitted to his role. Hartley looked down at his hands. Miss Marple turned to Clara. "You believed you caused Timothy's death because someone you trusted told you so. But the truth is, you arrived just moments after it happened. You saw the aftermath. You were used." Clara's throat tightened. "I didn't know." "I believe you." She looked now to Delphine. "You, Mrs. Ridley, manipulated your inheritance. You forged documents. You pressured the people around you into silence and deceit. But you did not kill Timothy Alderston." Delphine's mouth opened, then closed again. Her shoulders sagged, but there was no protest. The death was not planned. It was the result of panic, of a confrontation by the ravine where the Reverend, afraid of being exposed, lashed out. The blow wasn't meant to kill, but it did. And when Clara came running, you gave her your version of the story, a version that made you the protector, a version she never had reason to doubt. The room was utterly still. I wondered for a long time why Clara would take the blame. Miss Marple went on. Why she would hide evidence, confess, even mislead the police. And the answer was simple. She believed she was protecting someone she loved, but she had only been shown part of the picture. Hartley raised his head slowly. "I didn't mean to hurt him." "But you did," Miss Marple said, gently. "And then you let a young girl carry your guilt." He said nothing. "It was Timothy's glove that began to unravel the story," she continued. "A quiet accusation meant to be found. And the manuscript he left behind, the interviews, the will copies, the dates and inconsistencies, it all told the truth. He knew he might not finish his investigation, so he made sure someone else would." Miss Marple stood then, not abruptly, but with purpose. "I don't find satisfaction in exposing pain, but I do believe in truth. And it is my belief that Fernley must face it fully, not just the crimes of forgery or obstruction, but the failings that allowed such things to fester behind hedgerows and hymns." Sergeant Rowe cleared his throat. "The appropriate authorities will take it from here, but I believe we can all agree that justice has begun." The Reverend was led away quietly. Cora Feltham dabbed her eyes and said nothing. She had not known the will had been used, only that she had been silent for too long. Clara sat in a daze of grief and relief, the weight on her chest slowly lifting, and Delphine Ridley, who had not shed a single tear during the entire affair, merely stood, adjusted her shawl, and walked to the window. As she looked out over the garden, she spoke for the first time that hour. "I suppose I loved being believed in more than I loved anyone at all." No one answered. She didn't need them to. That night Miss Marple sat by her window with a cup of chamomile, her knitting untouched in her lap. She thought of Timothy Alderston, young, earnest, foolish in the best and worst of ways. He had followed a thread no one else dared to touch, and though it had cost him dearly, it had also done what he intended, brought the truth into the light. Fernley, for all its roses and hymns and scones, had secrets. But now, at least, it also had honesty. And in a village like this, that was something close to peace. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The rain did not return the next morning. Instead, Fernley awoke beneath a low, mist-hung sky that softened the sharpness of fences and gables, as if the village itself needed a day to settle its nerves. The headlines in the Midshire Gazette were modest. "Vicar resigns amid controversy," and "Missing Man's Journal sparks inquest." No dramatic photographs, no lurid descriptions, just the kind of careful prose that let the truth be known without shaking the teacups. But those who lived on Elder Tree Lane, and indeed most of Fernley, would not forget. The quiet had returned, yes, but not untouched. There was a new kind of silence, a knowing one. At Lower Meadow Cottage, Miss Marple was folding linens in the morning light when she heard the gate click. Through the lace of her kitchen curtain, she saw Clara Simmons hesitantly make her way up the garden path. Miss Marple greeted her with a warm smile and ushered her inside. "I'm leaving Fernley," Clara said after a cup of tea had been poured. Miss Marple nodded gently. "I thought you might. There's a family in Westmore, friends of my mother's. They've offered me a position. It's quiet work, nothing grand, but honest. That's all one needs to begin again." Clara bit her lip. "I still dream about that night. Not what I saw, but what I thought I saw." Miss Marple laid a hand on hers. "Your heart filled in the spaces with fear, and someone took advantage of that, but you've had the courage to correct the story, and that is no small thing." Clara nodded, eyes shining. "Will you write to me?" "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and you must promise to write me back. I expect updates on the flower beds." That earned the faintest smile from Clara. As she left, Miss Marple watched her go with a quiet pride. It was not every day a girl of 19 stood straighter after such a fall. A week passed, then 2. The official inquest concluded that Timothy Alderston's death had been caused by blunt trauma, the result of an altercation by the ravine. Though not premeditated, it was ruled unlawful. Rev Hartley resigned his position and would likely face charges, not out of vengeance, but necessity. A moral failing dressed in clerical robes was still a failing, and Fernley was not a parish to forget so easily. Delphine Ridley did not stay to see the legal proceedings unfold. She left the cottage under cover of dusk, carrying only a suitcase and her violin case, claiming she was done with English weather. No one saw her board the train, but the sound of a cab departing near the green was heard by at least 3 people, and confirmed by the station porter in the days that followed. The Ridley estate was restored to the Jessops, who sent a polite note from Yorkshire declining the offer to return. Instead, the property was put up for auction. "Too many memories," they wrote. "Some things are better left settled." Miss Marple resumed her life in full. Tea with Mrs. Merridew, the Women's Institute meetings, her usual walks through the churchyard where the roses had begun to bloom again. Yet there was a subtle change in her step, not a weariness but a gravity, an understanding that the truth, once found, carried its own kind of weight. It was on one of these walks that she found herself by the old willow at the edge of the ravine, the place where it had all happened. She sat on the bench nearby, the breeze lifting the hem of her skirt, and opened a letter she had received only that morning. "Dear Miss Marple, I am writing from Westmore, where the air is kind and no one knows my name. The family is kind as well. I tend the garden, as you suggested, and I have planted lilies. Timothy would have liked them, I think. Something clean, something hopeful. Thank you for believing me before I believed myself." Clara Miss Marple folded the letter, pressed it lightly to her chest, and gazed out at the trees. She thought of Timothy, of his glove, his notebook, his stubborn pursuit of justice in a place that often preferred niceties over truth. He had been young, earnest, perhaps reckless, but he had also been right, and thanks to a small glove and a sharper mind than most expected, his story had not vanished with him. Later that evening, back at the cottage, Miss Marple sat in her parlour chair as the fire crackled low. On the table beside her, the worn leather manuscript sat neatly tied with ribbon, ready to be posted to a distant cousin of Timothy's, a quiet woman in Bath, who would ensure it was properly archived. Beside it was a fresh piece of paper, on which Miss Marple had written, "Sometimes justice arrives not with thunder or the sound of handcuffs, but in the quiet closing of a case, the exhale of a village, and the planting of lilies where silence once grew." She signed it simply, Jane Marple. And then, as was her habit when the case was done, she reached once more for her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steadily. Outside the wind shifted, and in Fernley the truth finally rested.